Out on the frontier, some things are simple: land, cattle, and the clear line between right and wrong. But what happens when that line is blurred by a girl left for dead, treated not like a person, but like property? For a lone cowboy who had buried his past, he was about to learn that some debts aren't settled with money. They're paid in blood, loyalty, and courage. This is the story of how one broken soul became worth more than all the land in Wyoming. The first light of day had just drawn a thin, golden line across the jagged peaks of the Wyoming hills when a sound stabbed the air. It was not the howl of a wolf or the roar of a cougar. It was a choked, broken sob, a human sound that had no place in this desolate landscape. Jake Callahan froze, one hand still gripping the reins. He stood motionless, listening, his eyes narrowing against the thick, silver mist that still clung to the land. Then it came again, weaker this time, like the whimper of a creature draining of its last strength. Without a word, he dropped the reins, turned on his heel into the barn, and emerged a moment later with his old rifle in hand. He did not run. His steps were steady and deliberate, the solace of his boots crushing the cold, hard gravel beneath them. As the shape of the barn fell away behind him, he saw it. A figure, collapsed against his rough-hewn wooden fence, bound to the posts with coarse rope. Her dark hair was matted to her face by the night's dew. Her skin was as pale as marble. In the weak light, a tattered shawl did little to cover a body that trembled from the cold. Jake approached, rifle held low, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He could see the bruises on her wrists where the rope bit into her flesh. This was no accident. This was an act of cruelty. When he was only a few steps away, her eyes flew open. They were not empty, but blazed with the feral fire of a cornered creature. "Stay away from me." Her voice was a raw, broken rasp, yet full of defiance. Jake stopped instantly. "I won't hurt you." His voice was low and even, like the wind across the plains. He saw her chest heave with every labored breath. He saw it all, the fear, the pain, and a final shred of pride that had not yet been extinguished. He moved again slowly, then knelt. From his belt, he drew a small knife. He did not look into her eyes, but focused on the knots. "I'm Jake Callahan. This is my land. You're safe now." She said nothing, only watched his every move, waiting for a pain that never came. The sharp blade severed one cord after another. When the final rope at her ankles fell away, her body went limp and pitched forward. Jake caught her just enough to keep her from hitting the ground. Instead of carrying her, he took off his own thick flannel shirt, folded it, and gently placed it under her head. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a worn silver dollar, the last keepsake his mother had left him, and pressed it into her cold palm. A gesture not of pity, but of recognition. A whisper escaped her cracked lips. "My father, he left me." Jake's jaw clenched. He looked out toward the road, not a single track. "On this land," he said, his voice firm, "people are not things to be thrown away, not as long as I'm here." He stood, went to the barn, and returned with a wool blanket and a canteen. She drank in small sips, her hands still trembling. He didn't ask her name, not yet. He just knelt again and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "You'll rest here a moment. Then we'll figure out the rest." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Jake stepped back, leaning against the fence post, a silent watchman as the mist began to lift, revealing a world that had changed forever for them both. Jake lifted her as gently as if he were holding a fledgling with a broken wing. He said nothing, only nudged the wooden door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The cabin was a single space, smelling of pine wood and wood smoke, clean but bearing the marks of a long solitude. A small fire was smoldering in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough walls. He set her down in the old rocking chair by the hearth, the warmest spot. Then he began to move, without a word, without a question. The scrape of a match, the crackle of dry kindling being fed to the fire, the rhythmic chop of a knife against a wooden board. They were the familiar movements of a man long accustomed to caring for no one but himself. Emma did not move. Her eyes darted around the room, flicking to the door, then the window, then the rifle mounted above the hearth. Her body was rigid, poised for flight. But deep in her eyes, beneath the fear, was something else, a ravenous hunger, not just for food, but for safety, for proof. The aroma of broth, onion, and carrots began to fill the small space, chasing away the cold and the scent of the terror outside. After a while, Jake knelt beside her again, offering a cup of warm water. She took it with both hands and drank carefully, her lips still cracked. When the soup was ready, he ladled it into a tin bowl, broke a piece of bread, and set it all on a small table. Then he brought the bowl to her, knelt again, and offered her the spoon. Emma took it, but instead of eating, she lifted the bowl to her face and inhaled deeply, a primal act of a creature who had known betrayal. Jake understood. He needed no explanation. He simply rose, walked to the window, and looked out, his back a silent promise of the privacy she needed. Behind him, he heard the quiet clink of the spoon against the bowl, a pause, a soft swallow, then the scrape of bread against ceramic. When he finally turned back, the bowl was half empty. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes were no longer scanning for escape routes. He knelt again. Even slower this time, her voice came, rough and faint, but clear. "Why did you help me?" Jake met her gaze, his own unwavering. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached behind the hearth and retrieved an old, leather-bound book, its spine worn soft with time. He opened it to a page in the middle and gently slid out an object that had been pressed flat between the pages. It was a single wildflower, dry and delicate. He placed it on the table. "My mother gave me this," he said, his voice low. "The last day I saw her, before my father took me away." Emma's brow furrowed. Jake nodded. "She tucked it in my pocket and told me that whenever the world felt too cruel, I should look at it, to remind myself that even on the harshest ground, something beautiful can grow." He stared at the flower for a long moment, then met her eyes again. "I don't have much left. No family, no wife, no sons, just this land. But when I saw you on that fence, I remembered the flower." Something in Emma's expression cracked. Not broken, but softened. Jake leaned back. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not thanks, not trust. Just rest. You'll have time to decide what comes next." She looked down at the bowl, then at the flower. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's not withered." Jake nodded. It only took 3 days for the town of Stone Creek to reach its verdict. Jake Callahan, the recluse who never spoke to anyone, had taken in Earl Turner's girl. It wasn't out of mercy, they said, nor was it decency. They hinted at reasons. No man would dare speak aloud in front of his own daughter. Gossip in a small town is like a smoldering fire in dry grass. It doesn't need a strong wind to spread everywhere. Jake knew it. And Emma felt it. She heard it in the sudden silence. When she passed a window, she felt it in the stares that pricked her back like needles. Though she hadn't set foot off the ranch, the weight of their judgment pressed in through the cabin walls. That morning, she was standing by the door. She wore one of Jake's old shirts, cinched at the waist with a bit of twine. She had brushed her hair and cleaned her boots. Her chin was high, but her hands were twisting nervously at her sides. "I want to go with you today," she said. Jake looked up from the saddle he was mending. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm tired of hiding." He said nothing more, just reached for the spare hat on the wall, a wide-brimmed, soft felt, and gently placed it on her head. They rode into town together, side by side, but the silence around them grew thicker with every hoofbeat. Storefronts seemed to empty as they approached. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. A child was yanked away from a water trough by its mother. At the general store, Jake dismounted and tied the reins. Emma followed close behind, her head lowered just enough to see the steps, but not to meet any eyes. She was halfway up the wooden steps when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Well, I'll be." Martha Pritchard, the store owner's wife, a woman whose faith was as hard as rock and whose compassion was as barren as a desert, stepped out to block their path. Her face was puckered like a sour lemon. "Are you bringing your filth into town now, Jake?" Jake stepped forward, slightly shielding Emma with his body. "We're not looking for trouble, Martha." "Too late," Martha hissed. "That girl should be rotting in a jail cell, not playing house with a lonely man." Emma didn't speak, didn't move. Then came the final blow. The woman leaned over, and a glob of spit flew onto the wooden step, landing right next to the toe of Emma's boot. "Dregs," she muttered, the word curling with venom. "Get out of here." Jake didn't yell, didn't draw his gun. He just stepped closer, placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, turned her around, and led her back down the steps. Heads turned. Whispers rose, but Jake didn't flinch. They rode out of town in silence. Back at the ranch, Jake went straight to the barn without a word. Emma stepped inside, closed the door, and stood in the dim light of the room. The fire was out. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She went to the small table, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small, cracked mirror, barely larger than her palm. It had once belonged to Jake's mother. For the first time in days, she looked at herself. The bruises had faded to a sickly yellow. The cut on her lip was healing. Her hair, though clean, still held the wildness of her survival. Her tired, brown eyes stared back, as if at a stranger. Tears came, not from physical pain, but from the sharp, brutal realization that she no longer knew who she was. She didn't recognize the girl in the glass, nor did she know if that person had anything left worth fighting for. The mirror slipped from her hand, landing face down on the floor, unbroken. She collapsed beside it, pulling her knees to her chest, and let the tears fall without shame. Outside, the wind moved gently through the wheat. Inside, a girl wept beside a reflection she could no longer recognize. But behind her on the wooden table, the pressed wildflower still lay, fragile but whole, waiting silently. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a heavy leaden color, the kind that makes a man watch the horizon without knowing what he's waiting for. Jake had just hammered in the last post on the broken fence line when he heard the hoofbeats. It was not the relaxed rhythm of a neighbor, nor was it a familiar trot. This was a hurried, hostile pounding, and it was uninvited. He did not move from the post, did not reach for his rifle. He just stood there waiting. 3 riders crested the hill that bordered his land, the lead horse kicking up dust with disregard. The man in front sat sloppily on his horse, reins loose, a half-empty bottle sloshing in one hand. His hat was askew, covering a flushed face and an unkempt beard. His boots, once perhaps polished, were now as scuffed as his pride. Jake recognized him instantly. Earl Turner, Emma's father. The 2 men behind him were strangers, hired muscle by the look of them. One had a scar that cut across his cheek. The other had a lazy eye and knuckles that looked like they'd never properly healed from too many fights. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, silent and calm. Earl spotted him and raised the bottle in a greeting, as if they were old friends. "Jake Callahan," he slurred. "Hero of the plains. Heard you've been playing nursemaid to my little wildcat." Jake didn't blink. "What do you want, Earl?" The 2 henchmen fanned out slightly, forming a lazy arc that wasn't quite hostile, but certainly wasn't friendly. Earl stumbled off his horse, staggered a step, then steadied himself. "She's mine," he said. "Blood don't just disappear 'cause you say so." Jake remained motionless. "She stopped being yours the minute you left her to die." Earl's laugh was ugly, like rocks rattling in an empty bucket. "She ain't worth what she cost me. Gambling debts, food, shame. That girl's been a weight around my neck since the day she was born." Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I'm not in the habit of raising what another man threw away." "You think I came for a reunion?" Earl snapped. "I came for closure. She's a stain on my name. You keepin' her like some stray dog makes folks talk. I don't want her back. I want her gone." He took a step forward. Jake didn't move, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just said, very softly, "I don't feed mouths that bite. And I don't let cowards claim people like property." Earl's face reddened, his hand twitching toward his coat. "She's mine," he hissed. "I sired her, raised her, and if I want to end her story, that's between me and God." "She isn't yours," Jake replied, still calm, but each word was heavier than the last. "She doesn't belong to you. She never did." A wind kicked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that stood beside the porch. Jake's gaze shifted, just for a moment, toward the tree, then back to Earl. "If you still think you have." "All right," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Then go ahead. Step through that gate. Try to set foot on this porch. I'll give you a plot of your own right under that tree." He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to. The scar-faced rider shifted uneasily in his saddle. The one with the lazy eyes spat in the dust but didn't move. Earl stared at Jake for a long time, breathing hard, his chest heaving like a man trying to summon courage from an empty well. Then his eyes flicked to the porch, to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, and to the open cabin window, where a sliver of Emma's shadow was visible behind the curtain. Jake took one slow step forward. Earl took 2 steps back. He turned, stumbled to his horse, and climbed up with more effort than grace. "She ain't worth dying for, Callahan," he shouted as he pulled his reins. Jake didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't even watch them leave. He just turned, walked to the porch, picked up the rifle, and sat down on the steps. He placed the rifle across his lap, not in a ready stance, but like a comfort. Inside, Emma's breath trembled behind the curtain. Outside, the hoofbeats faded, and 3 men rode away, carrying something heavier than defeat. It was shame. The rain came without warning, raindrops lashing the barn's tin roof like thousands of scratching fingernails. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that rolled low and deep, like the echo of a buried grief. Inside, Jake and Emma sat near a small fire, their backs to the wall. The old building creaked gently around them. Emma clutched Jake's coat around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something older, loneliness perhaps, or a kind of quiet survival. Jake fed another piece of kindling to the fire, then leaned back, one arm resting across his knee. The storm outside could have drowned the world, but neither of them moved. They sat in a knowing silence, the kind that understands not to rush a truth. Then Emma spoke, her voice thin but sharp. "I was 15 the first time he tried to trade me." Jake didn't look over, he waited. He lost a card game. "Sighed I could clear the debt." The other man looked me up and down, like one inspects a horse. Then he shook his head. "Sighed I was too thin, a flawed piece of merchandise." She pulled her knees up, her arms tight around them. "Earl beat me after, said I'd embarrassed him. That I was a curse, that even death wouldn't take me, because the devil had no use for what no man wanted." Jake removed his hat, setting it beside him. "He told me I was why my mama died, why the house was always cold, why he drank." Jake still didn't speak. He just unbuttoned his shirt and turned slightly toward the firelight. Old scars, pale white and cruel, were etched deep into his broad back, like the words of a silent story. Emma's breath caught. "Who did that?" "My father," Jake said quietly. "He believed obedience was the price of love." He paused. "I didn't pay." He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out the small, worn silver locket. "She gave me this the day she died," he said. "Told me it wasn't worth much, but if I ever found someone who needed something to hold on to, maybe it would be." "Enough." He placed it in her hand. Emma stared at it. Then her fingers closed around the metal. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered. "I'm not clean, not whole." Jake's eyes met hers. "You're not broken," he said. "You're alive. That means you still get to choose what comes next." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't think I deserve this," she said. "This fire. This coat. You." Jake leaned just a little closer, not enough to trap her, just enough to hold the space. "No one is born deserving of anything, Emma. We seize that worthiness by how we live, by what we give back. You don't need to be new. You just need to be honest and brave." Her tears slipped free, quiet and real. And when her head fell onto his shoulder, he didn't speak, nor did he move. He just sat there, steady as a rock in a fierce current, letting her lean on him. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something softer began to grow. Not love, not yet, but the roots had taken hold. Just after dawn, the wind shifted, carrying something more than the scent of rain. Jake felt it before he saw it, an unease that settled in the bones, that made the birds fall silent and his dog paced near the door. He stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon, and then he saw them, dust rising. 5 riders in long coats the color of rust, the color of dried blood, rifles slung low, hats pulled tight against the light. They moved in a slow arc, like a pack of wolves testing the fence line of a herd. Jake counted their shadows. 5 men, but only one mattered. The one in the center rode a black horse with white stockings and a silver-trimmed saddle. He didn't need to wear a sheriff's badge. Across the Wyoming territory, everyone knew the name Marcus Devlin. Jake didn't wait for a knock. He turned on his heel and bolted into the house. "It's time, Emma." His voice was tight but calm. She didn't ask. "What for?" She already had the canvas bag right by the door, ammunition, a spare Colt, a water canteen, and the silver locket Jake had given her. Jake shoved the table in front of the door, locked the windows, and moved to the crawl space behind the hearth. He'd built it years ago, never knowing why. Now he did. They slipped out the back, their boots muffled in the damp earth, their breath quickened. Jake led Emma through the brush toward the old barn. The sky was low and gray, the sun a dull smear. Behind it, inside the barn, Jake hoisted her up into the loft and handed her his Winchester. 2 shots at a time, he said, then reload. Aim for the legs, not the chest. It'll slow them down. Emma swallowed hard. You'll know when. He gave her one last look, then vanished into the stalls below. Moments later, the gunfire started. It came in a burst, wild and erratic, a warning. Devlin's men wanted compliance, not carnage. But Jake knew their kind. If they got inside, they'd burn everything just to send a message. From the rafters, he picked them off, silent and exact. One went down with a cry, grabbing his knee. Another spun backward into the dirt, cursing. The others scrambled, confused. Then one got close, too close. He kicked open the side door of the barn, rifle raised, and swept the shadows with his barrel. Jake crouched low behind a stack of hay bales, holding his breath. The man moved past, careless and cocky. Jake lunged. They hit the ground hard. Jake's shoulders slammed into the boards, his fist catching the man's jaw just before the man's rifle fired wide. But the other man was bigger, fueled by adrenaline and the promise of a payday. They rolled in the dust, boots kicking, hands scrambling. The man drew a knife, slashing across Jake's arm. Jake grunted, gripped the man's wrist, and twisted hard. Then, a single shot rang out, dry and decisive, not from Jake's gun. From above, the man's head jerked sideways. He collapsed, blood pooling in the straw. Jake looked up. Emma was still holding the rifle, shaking like a leaf in a storm. He didn't call out to her. He didn't need to. He just nodded. She nodded back. Jake staggered to his feet, pressing a hand to the cut on his arm. Outside, the remaining men shouted for retreat, but Devlin didn't move. He sat still on his horse, watching the barn like a man sizing up a building he intended to own. Then he dismounted, slow and deliberate, and walked to the fence line. Jake stepped out to meet him. They stood 10 paces apart, no weapons drawn, just two men with too much to lose. "She's mine, Devlin," Jake said flatly. "Collateral. I don't care where she's run or what she's told you. She belongs to me." Jake didn't blink. "You trade cattle land contracts, not people." "She's not people," Devlin sneered. "She's my property. And when someone steals from me, there's a price." Jake's voice dropped. "Then send your bill. But if you or your men come near this land again, I'll make sure the only thing you own is a plot 6 feet deep." Devlin's smile was small and cold. "I respect a man with conviction, Jake. It's rare. Foolish, but rare." He turned, mounted his horse, and raised his voice loud enough for Emma to hear. "This isn't over. The girl is mine. And one day, I'll come to collect." Then he rode off into the morning light, his men limping behind him. The dust from their horses was already starting to settle. Jake stood alone in the silence, blood running down his sleeve. Behind him, Emma stepped out of the barn. She looked at the body, at the gun still clutched in her hand, then at him. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said. Jake walked over, placed a hand on her shoulder. "No," he said. "You chose to live." The rain began again, soft this time, almost like forgiveness. And from the porch, the fire inside the cabin still burned. As spring arrived, the scars on the land began to fade, just like the scars in people's hearts. The bullet holes in the barn wall were patched, the fence line stood straight, and the roof, once ravaged by weather and chaos, was now sturdy with new nails and sweet-smelling pine boards. Jake rebuilt in silence, as he had always lived. But this time, he was not alone. Emma was often up before dawn, her bare feet on the damp earth, planting rows of carrots, onions, and even wildflowers in the garden she had staked out behind the cabin. She used wire and leftover wood to mend the chicken coop. She organized the pantry, swept the floors, and even fixed the front steps with an old hammer that seemed too big for her hands, but never missed its mark. The neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them now came over with tools. A woman from town brought seeds. An old rancher helped dig post holes. No one said sorry for the silence that had come before, but Emma didn't need their words. She saw it in the gifts left on the porch: a half-dozen fresh eggs, a jar of jam, a bolt of cloth. They respected her because she had survived. Jake said very little. He didn't know how to praise with words, but he fixed her favorite teapot when it cracked and made sure the garden gate always swung open smoothly. He repaired her boots without being asked, setting them by the fire each night, clean and dry. But it was the chair that told her everything. It appeared one evening in early June. Emma had been inside preparing stew when she heard the soft scrape of wood across the porch. She stepped out and saw Jake standing beside it, not looking at her, just staring off toward the wheat fields, the last sun of the day catching the curve of his jaw. The chair was simple and strong, its back curved, its arms hand-carved and sanded, smooth from hours of work. But it was the thing at the very top that made her breath stop. 2 letters carved carefully, small and perfect. ECEMM. A didn't speak. She walked over, sat down slowly, and let her fingers trace the letters. Jake kept hammering a fence post nearby, not looking her way, but he was listening. "You made." "This for me?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Figured you needed a place to rest." She smiled. The wood was warm from the sun, and the view stretched out forever. A place to sit. A place that said, "You belong here." A few minutes passed, the breeze carrying the scent of sage and fresh earth. Then Emma said, almost too quietly to hear, "What if one day I wanted to change my last name?" Jake paused mid-swing, the hammer resting on the post. He didn't turn, didn't smile. He said, his voice even, "I think that's a fine idea." He paused for a beat. "But we'll have to flip a coin to decide who takes whose name." Emma blinked, and then she laughed, a deep, surprised sound that made the birds scatter from the rooftop. Jake finally looked over his shoulder. She was still smiling, that rare, real kind of smile that starts in the chest and blooms across the face like a sunrise. Jake tipped his hat back and chuckled once. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "It's just, no one's ever offered to be mine before." He nodded, though not quite looking at her, but she saw the red climbing up the back of his neck. They didn't speak of love, didn't exchange promises, but that night, as they sat on the porch together, Emma in her chair, Jake whittling something unseen, everything they needed to say had already been said. The sky faded from gold to blue. The stars came out quiet and sure. And from inside the house, the silver locket Emma now wore around her neck caught the firelight and glowed. The fire was small, just a circle of dry twigs and pine needles behind the barn, where the wind could carry the smoke away without choking the house. Jake stood alone, the paper in his hands trembling, not from fear, but from finality. It was a yellowed piece of paper, its folds as brittle as dry leaves, signed in the cruel ink of Earl Turner. A crude agreement, barely legal, and certainly immoral. One girl, age 18, in lieu of a $500 debt. No names, just descriptions, just terms, just black ink trying to make property of blood. Jake looked at it a moment longer, then bent low and held it to the flame. It caught fast, a blaze of dry anger, curling into black, hungry edges. The scraps of ash flew up, swirling in the air before disappearing into the honey-colored Wyoming sunset. He watched them go. Behind him, the house was quiet. Inside, Emma stood before the mirror in her white dress. A simple cotton thing she had sewn herself. No lace, no corset, no veil. Just soft fabric, wildflowers braided through her hair, and bare feet against the floorboards. Outside, the town gathered. Not many, just enough. The sheriff stood beneath the oak tree. Miss Lark brought her fiddle. Mrs. Merriweather from the cafe brought a pie and a bouquet. Even the blacksmith came. His hands scrubbed raw for the first time in years. They lined the dirt path leading from the house to the tree, where Jake now waited in a clean shirt, his hat pressed to his chest. And then she came. Emma walked alone. No one led her by the hand. No one gave her away, because she was no one's to be given. Her steps were slow and steady, each one pressing a little deeper into the soil she now called home. Her eyes didn't search the crowd for judgment, didn't flinch at the sight of familiar faces. The girl who had once been dragged to a fence like an unwanted burden now walked with the posture of a woman who had survived, rebuilt, and chosen to live. The town watched her pass, and for once, they whispered only kind things. When she reached the tree, Jake looked up and smiled. Not wide, not grand, just enough. They stood before each other, their hands brushing, their hearts still. The sheriff cleared his throat, but said nothing more. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, bent from a horseshoe nail, which had been filed and polished until it caught the light. He slipped it onto her finger, his eyes locked with hers. "No one is giving you to me," he said softly. "You came here on your own, and I am proud to stand beside you." Emma didn't cry. She just nodded. And in that moment, a wind picked up, stirring her dress, sending the smell of sagebrush through the air like a blessing. They didn't kiss in front of everyone. They didn't need to. The ceremony ended with quiet applause, a few cheers, and a fiddle tune that danced across the prairie dot as the sun dipped low. They returned home. They didn't speak much, just poured 2 cups of coffee, lit the lantern, and sat together on the porch as the sky went soft and purple around them. Emma leaned back in her chair, the one with her initials carved into the top rail, and watched the fireflies blink through the wheat dot. Jake reached for her hand, calloused and warm. He looked over, his eyes soft, a hint of something boyish breaking through his weathered face. "Evenin', Mrs. Callahan," he said. Emma turned toward him, her fingers tightening around his. "Evenin', Mr. Callahan," she replied. They sat like that as the light faded, the cabin behind them aglow, the world ahead wide and untamed. Above them, the stars came out, slow, certain, and familiar. And as the wind carried the last ashes of an old debt far into the dark, it left behind something new, not silence, not sorrow, but peace. A love born not of rescue, but of choice.